Amelia's world was once simple and full of innocence. She lived in a small, peaceful town where the streets were safe, and every house had a story. As a young girl, she spent most of her days playing in the yard, her laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Her parents were loving, and their home was filled with warmth. Amelia had everything a child could dream of: toys, books, and a family that adored her. But in one fateful moment, everything changed. It was a bright, sunny morning when Amelia's life was ripped apart. She was playing near her house, chasing after a butterfly in the garden, when a strange man approached her. He was tall and had a soft voice, promising her candy and toys if she came with him. Amelia, trusting the world around her, followed him without a second thought. She was just 5 years old, too innocent to understand the danger that lurked in the shadows. The man's smile seemed kind, and his promises seemed harmless. But the man had other plans. Instead of leading her to a store filled with sweets, he led her far away from home, through alleyways and dark streets that she had never seen before. Amelia, confused and scared, began to ask questions, but he ignored her, telling her everything would be fine. As they reached an abandoned van, the man forced her inside, locking the doors behind them. The moment the van started moving, Amelia's heart began to race. She didn't understand where they were going, or why, but her gut told her something was terribly wrong. The journey felt endless. Amelia, still young and small, didn't have the strength to fight back. She was trapped, the world outside unfamiliar and cold. She tried to scream, but the man shoved a cloth over her mouth, suffocating her cries. Her small hands grasped at the seats in desperation, but no one could hear her. Amelia's mind raced with thoughts of her parents, wondering why they hadn't come to find her. The feeling of helplessness washed over her, and for the first time in her young life, she felt the weight of fear and uncertainty. The van stopped in a secluded area, and Amelia was dragged out by the man. She was taken into a dark building, where the air was thick and musty. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she could barely make out the faces of other children who were just as frightened as she was. Some of them were crying, others staring blankly, their eyes hollow with fear. The man who had taken her disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone in the cold, unfamiliar place. Amelia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the fear rising with each passing moment. Days turned into weeks, and Amelia's reality became a nightmare. The man who had taken her was not the only one involved. There were others, men and women, who ran the operation, treating the children like commodities, not human beings. Amelia soon realized that she wasn't the only one trapped in this place. There were many others, all victims of a ruthless network that preyed on innocent children. She was no longer a little girl playing in the garden. She had been sold, her life no longer her own. Despite the horror she endured, Amelia's spirit didn't break. Every night she dreamed of escaping, of finding her way back home to her parents, and of reclaiming the childhood that had been stolen from her. But escape was no easy task. The building where she was held was heavily guarded, and the traffickers kept a tight grip on the children they controlled. Amelia knew she had to be patient and careful. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Her hope, though dimmed by fear, was her only ally in that dark, forsaken place. Amelia spent years in captivity, each day blending into the next, a blur of fear, pain, and despair. She had grown older, but the scars of her childhood remained etched in her mind, lingering like ghosts that refused to leave. The building where she was held became a prison of her own creation, each wall closing in tighter as the days passed. Despite everything, a small, burning spark of hope refused to be extinguished within her. It had become a part of her, an anchor that kept her alive in the darkest moments. For the first time in years, Amelia noticed something different. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it sent a shiver down her spine. One of the traffickers, a man she had never seen before, walked through the building's dimly lit hallways with a purposeful stride. There was something unsettling about him, a coldness in his eyes, a quiet authority that suggested he was no ordinary member of the operation. Amelia's instincts kicked in. She had been watching the traffickers for years, observing their routines, their mannerisms, and their habits. This man was new, and he didn't fit into the patterns she had learned to predict. For weeks, Amelia observed him from the shadows. She noted his movements, the way he interacted with the others, and most importantly, the way he looked at her. There was a familiarity in his gaze, something unsettling yet recognizable. She couldn't place it at first, but the more she watched him, the more certain she became she had seen this man before. The memory of her abduction flashed in her mind like a painful jolt. She saw his face, hidden behind a mask when he had first taken her from her home. He had been the one who had sold her into this nightmare when she was just 5 years old. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. He was the one who had started it all, the one who had ripped her away from everything she had known. He was no longer a faceless figure in the shadows of her memory. He was standing right in front of her, and he was vulnerable. He was no longer the masked man who controlled her fate. He was here in the same place as her, within her reach. The more she studied him, the more Amelia's resolve solidified. She wasn't going to let this chance slip away. This was her moment, her only chance to take control of her destiny. Over the next few weeks, she began to plan meticulously. She had learned everything she needed to know about the building, its guards, the routines of the traffickers, and the flow of the operation. Every night, as she lay in the dark, her mind worked tirelessly, piecing together a plan of action. But it wasn't just about escape anymore. It wasn't enough to simply run. Amelia realized that she had a larger goal in mind. She needed to make this man pay for what he had done to her. He had stolen her childhood, her innocence, and her freedom. Now it was her turn to take control. She was no longer the scared little girl who had been trapped in a van all those years ago. She had grown stronger, smarter, and more determined. But as she set her plan into motion, something else began to happen. Amelia started to see things she hadn't before. The building she had once viewed as a prison began to reveal its secrets. There were hidden passages, forgotten rooms, and escape routes that had never crossed her mind. With each passing day, Amelia's understanding of the facility deepened and her confidence grew. She knew she was running out of time. The trafficker who had sold her was still here, but so was the rest of the network, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who posed a threat. Amelia knew this was going to be dangerous, but for the first time in her life she felt a sense of purpose, something she had lost long ago. She was ready. She would confront her past, confront the man who had sold her, and she would do whatever it took to escape. The nightmare had lasted long enough. As the days wore on, Amelia's thoughts became consumed with the trafficker's operation. She had spent so many years trapped in a world of fear, her every move dictated by those who held the power. But now, with the realization that the man who had sold her was within reach, her mind was sharp, calculating. She wasn't just planning her escape, she was planning the downfall of the entire network. She understood now that if she simply ran, she would be nothing more than a fleeting memory to the traffickers, an unimportant casualty in their sprawling web of exploitation. No, she needed to expose them all, bring them down piece by piece. The building she was held in was more than just a holding facility. It was a central hub for trafficking where victims were gathered, stored, and then sent out to various parts of the world. There were others like her, some younger, some older, all trapped in the same nightmare. She had seen the others coming and going, but it wasn't until she began to pay closer attention to the traffickers' behavior that she started to piece together the bigger picture. There were key players in the operation, men and women who appeared to be in charge of different parts of the process. Amelia had learned over the years to stay under the radar, blending in with the other victims. But now, with her mind focused on exposing the network, she took careful note of the smallest details, the guards' movements, the way the traffickers communicated, and the subtle shifts in power. She had overheard snippets of conversations about shipments, locations, and the names of people involved. The traffickers didn't realize it, but Amelia had become a shadow, always watching, always listening. Her next step was to gain access to their inner circle. Amelia knew that she couldn't act alone. She needed to build alliances, even if it meant pretending to cooperate with the traffickers. She began to manipulate her captors, feigning submission, allowing them to believe that she had resigned herself to her fate. The traffickers, overconfident in their control, didn't suspect that she was planning anything. They saw her as just another victim, helpless and compliant. But Amelia was anything but helpless. She played her part well, gaining the trust of one of the lower-level traffickers who seemed to take a particular interest in her. He was a man who had been with the operation for years but had not yet earned a prominent position. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and Amelia saw this as her opportunity. She began to engage him in casual conversations, feeding him false information about her supposed acceptance of her situation. Slowly, she lured him into believing that she might be useful to the network. It wasn't long before he began to share more than he should have, discussing the trafficking routes, the people involved, and the operation structure. Amelia listened carefully, absorbing every detail. One day, the trafficker invited her to meet with one of the higher-ups, a woman who seemed to have a significant role in organizing the operations. Amelia knew this was the perfect chance to gather more information. She pretended to be interested, eager to please, all while listening to every word the woman said. As the conversation unfolded, Amelia's suspicions were confirmed. The trafficking ring was much larger and more organized than she had imagined. The network stretched across borders, with connections in multiple countries. The people behind it were not just ruthless criminals, they were powerful, untouchable. As Amelia continued to play her role, she realized just how deep the corruption ran. She began to feel the weight of her mission. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a part of something bigger, a force that could bring down the entire operation. But as her involvement with the traffickers deepened, so did the danger. The more she knew, the more at risk she became. Amelia understood that she couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything would be lost. She had to be patient and calculated, using every bit of information to her advantage. Her escape wasn't just about her freedom. It was about ensuring the network was destroyed, that no other innocent child would suffer the same fate she had. But Amelia knew that time was running out. The trafficker who had sold her was still out there, and he was growing more suspicious of her. If she didn't act soon, the window of opportunity would close. She needed to move quickly, but carefully, knowing that each step brought her closer to the ultimate confrontation. The plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back. Amelia's resolve had never been stronger. She was ready to take down the operation from the inside, no matter the cost. Amelia's plan was beginning to take shape, though each day felt like walking on a tightrope, the slightest misstep potentially catastrophic. Her interaction with the trafficker she had gained the trust of was starting to pay off. He believed her story, believed that she was just another broken, compliant soul waiting to be sent out to one of their many clients. Amelia used this to her advantage, feeding him bits of information that made her seem like an asset to the operation. She was careful, never pushing too hard or revealing too much. She knew that one wrong move could lead to her being silenced, or worse, sent to another location where she would lose any chance of executing her plan. The warehouse, the place where the traffickers kept the children and victims before moving them to other locations, was the heart of the operation. It was dark, grimy, and heavily guarded. Amelia had spent years memorizing every inch of it, learning where the cameras were hidden, where the guards made their rounds, and where the blind spots were. She knew the layout by heart, every exit, every corner, every creaky floorboard. But she also knew that no matter how well she knew the place, she couldn't do this alone. She had started quietly communicating with a few of the older victims in the facility. At first, she approached them cautiously, aware that they too were fearful and broken. But as they began to trust her, they opened up, sharing their own stories, their fears, and their hopes for escape. Some of them had given up, resigned to their fate, but others, like Amelia, still clung to the idea of freedom. She made plans with a few of them, organizing secret meetings when the traffickers weren't looking. They didn't trust easily, but they trusted her, and she knew she couldn't do this without their help. Amelia also realized that the trafficker who had sold her, the one who was now part of her plan, would be alone soon. His shift was coming to an end, and he would be heading to a secluded part of the warehouse where he often took breaks. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had no more time to waste. Everything had to fall into place perfectly for the plan to succeed. She wasn't just going to escape, she was going to confront him. Confront the man who had stolen her childhood, and end this nightmare once and for all. The day arrived with an ominous feeling in the air. Amelia could feel the tension building inside her as she moved silently through the facility, her heart pounding in her chest. She had learned that the trafficker was alone in his usual spot. He had no idea that she was about to turn the tables on him. The key to this plan was timing. She had to lure him into a trap without alerting the other guards or arousing suspicion. She took a deep breath and began to execute the first phase of the plan. She walked toward the area where he would be, pretending to be just another lost, beaten soul. As she neared him, she saw the look in his eyes, the same coldness she remembered from when she was a child, when he had stolen her innocence. This time, however, there was something different. Amelia was no longer the frightened little girl who had been sold. She was a woman determined to take back control of her life. As she approached him, she made eye contact. He smiled, believing she was still the same person he had manipulated so many years ago. But that smile quickly faded as he realized something was wrong. Amelia wasn't afraid. She wasn't compliant. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was in control. Before he could react, she moved quickly, knocking him off guard. The struggle that ensued was brief but intense. She fought with everything she had, using the anger, the pain, and the years of torment that had built up inside her as fuel. She overpowered him, pushing him to the ground. As he lay there, gasping for air, Amelia's voice was steady cold. It was the moment she had dreamed of for so long, the moment when she took back what was hers. She didn't kill him. That wasn't the point. Amelia's victory wasn't in violence, it was in taking back her life, her freedom. She knew what had to happen next. She quickly tied him up, making sure he couldn't escape, then took the key to the storage rooms from his pocket. This was the moment when everything would change. She would expose the network, set the plan into motion, and finally free herself and the others. She had taken down one of the biggest players in the trafficking ring, but her journey wasn't over. She knew this was only the beginning. As she stood there looking down at the trafficker who had once held all the power over her, Amelia couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. She had confronted her past, and in doing so she had set the stage for the network's downfall. There was no turning back now. The moment Amelia had dreamed of for so long had finally arrived, but it wasn't the end. It wasn't the relief she had expected either. When she looked at the trafficker lying helplessly before her, bound and vulnerable, there was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction. Instead, she felt the weight of everything that had happened to her, the years of abuse, the pain, and the betrayal. For a moment she questioned everything. Was this justice, or was it simply vengeance? But as she stared down at him, she knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. Exposing the system, bringing down the network that had destroyed so many lives, and ensuring that no one else would ever go through what she had. With the trafficker incapacitated, Amelia quickly set her plan into motion. She grabbed the keys from his pocket and made her way through the building, moving swiftly and quietly. Her heart pounded, but she knew she couldn't hesitate now. The other children, the other victims, those who had been trapped in this nightmare for years, needed her. She couldn't leave them behind, not when she was so close to breaking free. She reached the storage rooms where the other victims were kept in confinement. One by one, she unlocked the doors, her hands trembling as she freed each of them. The faces of the children reflected the same fear, the same emptiness she had once felt. Some of them were too young to understand what was happening, while others were too broken to believe they could escape. But Amelia spoke to them, not with words but with actions showing them that freedom was possible. She led them to the back door, the one exit that wasn't guarded, the one path that could lead them out of this hell. As she and the others slipped into the night, the sound of sirens began to grow louder in the distance. Amelia's heart raced as she realized that law enforcement was on their way. She had made contact with them earlier, ensuring that the authorities would be in place when she made her move. It had been a calculated risk, but it was working. She had exposed the operation, and now it was time for it to come crashing down. But as they neared the exit, Amelia felt a sudden wave of dread wash over her. She had done it, she had freed the victims, set the plan into motion, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was then that she realized the truth. The trafficker who had been part of her escape, the one who had taken her out of the building, had been part of a much larger conspiracy. The authorities had arrived, but there were others involved, people she had never even suspected. As she stepped into the night, her mind raced with the implications of what was happening. She had exposed one part of the operation, but the rest of it was still out there, hidden in plain sight. The realization hit her hard. Someone close to her had been involved in her abduction. She had trusted them, relied on them, never suspecting that they had been part of the plan all along. The truth was unbearable. Her own mother, desperate and broken, had been the one who sold her to the traffickers all those years ago. Amelia's world was shattered once again. She had been betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. The shock of the revelation nearly paralyzed her, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to break down now. The traffickers were being arrested, the building was being swarmed by law enforcement, and the children were safe. But there was still work to be done. The operation had many layers, and even though she had exposed a major part of it, the entire network needed to be dismantled. Amelia knew that this would be a long fight, one that wouldn't end with the authorities arresting a few criminals. She had to make sure the entire network crumbled. But that would come later. For now, Amelia's thoughts returned to the children she had freed, the victims who had once been like her, lost, forgotten, and abandoned. She had given them a second chance at life, and in doing so she had begun to heal her own wounds. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the scars of her past would never fade, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. She had fought for her freedom, for the freedom of the others, and she had won. Now it was time for the world to know the truth, for the victims to be heard, and for justice to be served. As the authorities rounded up the remaining traffickers and the children were safely taken into protective custody, Amelia knew that her journey was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She had faced the darkest part of her past and emerged stronger. She had found her voice, and with it, she would make sure that those who had been lost to the darkness would never be forgotten again.